quick message before we start. We hope our conversations open up new perspectives and new ideas for our listeners, and our goal is to be informative. But we want to emphasize that this isn't a substitute for individual therapy, and we're not providing medical or psychological advice here. If you feel moved by what you hear, and if you want to explore it more deeply, or if there's something in your life you'd like to work on, please reach out to an LGBTQ affirming therapist online or in your area. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to the Psych Out Podcast, where we find queer joy in demystifying gender, sexuality, representation, and care through the lens of psychological study.
Hey, this is Jen. A few minutes after recording this episode, we saw news reporting that the National Park Service had removed the T in LGBT on the website for the Stonewall National Monument. And if you know anything about the history of Stonewall and why and how it happened is as ahistorical as it is obscene. And I felt like I needed to add something to what we said in this episode to acknowledge the way that we are at an inflection point or a turning point where we can make the decision not to follow the history that came before us, where we can make a decision as a community not to splinter and turn against each other. And from a psychological perspective, I really want to acknowledge the temptation that many people might have to try to bargain away other people's safety for their own. And I know that that comes out of fear. And I really hope that looking at history and looking at the ways that we have been able to overcome moments like this in the past, even though those moments weren't exactly the same, will really help inspire all of us to make decisions in spite of our fear to keep taking care of each other.
And now your hosts, Chris and Jen.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Psych Out Podcast. I'm Chris, and I'm here with my very good friend.
Hey, I'm Dr. Jen, and I'm super excited to talk about the topic that we've chosen for today. And I think it's really timely, too. And the origin for this is that I got really, really excited looking at some history that I was reading, which tends to really excite me. And I was reading it in the context of the things going on in gender affirming care and the politics of that right now in February 2025. Right. And we just recently made the decision to re-record a demystifying gender affirming care episode. And this felt like the right direction to go in right now. And what we're going to talk about is an example of LGBTQ history, and in this case, specifically trans history, that rhymes with the history that we're experiencing now. And we're going to talk a little bit about, like, from one angle, the involvement of psychology in a lot of that history. Psychology and psychiatry, we'll just put them in the same boat. They were at the time. And also the value of knowing this history and sharing this history psychologically with people that we might work with in the community or for ourselves.
Yeah. So giving a good example that Jen's found resonant. And when they told me, I was so excited to do an episode, really digging into this. And then, talking a little more about, how this can be helpful psychologically and how it can be helpful for those of us who are clinicians on our own time to enrich our understanding of people we're working with, be that individual clients or populations or smaller communities that, don't have the benefit of showing up in the history books that we might have been given.
Yeah. Well said. So the first half, I'm going to kind of tell a story, and I'm going to tell it with two frameworks. So I might tell it with one framework and then retell it with the other one. And then second half, Chris is going to take the lead and talk about, clinical applications is one way of putting it. It's a very formal, psychology therapy way to put it. But this is just also human applications, living your life in the world with other people applications, right? And with yourself. It touches on all those things. All right. So we're going to go in the way back to the 50s and the 60s. And maybe contrary to what many of us imagine or assume, the 50s and 60s were actually a time when gender affirming care was flourishing to the extent that it could flourish. It was expanding. There were many, many university centers and big research centers that were doing a lot of like forward thinking and progress in the field of gender affirming care, both in terms of hormones and surgeries, right? And there was kind of a general sense of, especially in the late 60s and the early 70s, as the gay liberation movement was really rolling and, hippies were really in, and, playing with gender was a kind of a thing that like the popular people were into.
Yeah, you get the what's the first thing you describe a hippie as? Long hair.
Yeah.
But you're implying male.
Yeah.
And then you're using long hair as an insult.
Yeah, exactly. So like gender transgression was, there was pushback against it, but there was very strong resistance to that pushback. And a lot of that was part of the like anti-war movement, right? A man with long hair was saying, I'm not going to the military and cutting my hair.
Right. I'm not getting their crew cut. I'm not getting the flat top.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a big flourishing. And I know that there's not a direct, it's, a guy with long hair isn't the same thing as a trans person by far.
Not at all. But
there was social and countercultural sort of protection, shell of protection around that medical community, that network of medical providers. And one of the like main people associated with this time medically is a man named Dr. Harry Benjamin, who was the head of the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins University, which was sort of the leading place where this research was happening. And he was very, very well known. The thing that let me pause. Lots of this again from Susan Stryker's Transgender History that I will talk about endlessly because it's amazing. So if you're interested, read more. I read some other stuff too. And like, we love Wikipedia, the glorious Wikipedia pages about some of these figures. But there's a quote that Stryker has in the book that was in a memoir about Harry Benjamin. And it was a quote from a client, not an autobiography, a biography. It was a quote by a client basically saying, Dr. Benjamin listened.
Wow.
And defined who we were based on what we said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And if you think back to the way we talked about diagnosis of gender identity and gender dysphoria, that was so forward thinking. Right? It was there all friggin' along. It was there. And then things kind of fell apart. And in the psychiatry community, one of the main things that happened, although of course there were factors behind this happening, was after Dr. Benjamin left that post, they hired a Dr. Paul McHugh, who is socially very conservative and extremely influenced by the gender ideologies of the Catholic Church, sort of across the board, and almost immediately shut down trans healthcare at Johns Hopkins. And that was the domino that caused the other major institutions to fall.
Yeah.
Right. No law made them do that. Right. Scared people with bad opinions made them do that. So, and I will say Dr. McHugh in our Rogues Gallery was also one of the major psychiatric voices behind Prop 8, which as a Californian, I don't know if the rest of the country knows what that is. But anyway, anti-same-sex marriage that was really heartrending and awful in 2008. 2008? Yes, 2008.
Yeah, it was 2008 because it was just as I was, Yeah,
it was when Obama was elected. Same election.
Yeah, same year.
So anyway, that is sort of a way in which just individuals in the psychiatric community, individuals in power in medical systems are able to have huge influence over the experiences of LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
And sorry, go on.
I'll say, I think this continues. We talked a lot when we were organizing this episode about, did we want to look at this from the bottom up, talk about movements and the people who comprise this movements, or did we want to talk about, historical figures who could be seen as acting out the ideas of those movements and having outside influence when I read papers today, I see a lot of the same names talking about gender affirming care, and this is
Dr. McHugh is still doing it, still testifying. Yeah.
Yeah, he's still doing his name I didn't know before we started talking, but I mean I think there's so much value in, looking from the bottom up, looking at the social history of what it means to be trans in this country. But one of the reasons that I like talking about, these individual doctors is because it really is a field where the individual personalities and biases, my gods, of people have an outsized influence.
Yeah, I think once you have, especially once you have doctor in front of your name, even that, and I say that as a doctor of psychology, so not even an MD, but once you have doctor in front of your name, or you have the label therapist, you have an outside influence on people's opinions.
Yeah.
So you have to, if you are not educated about these things, you can do a lot of harm because your voice is louder than other voices.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And if you come into a room intending to do harm, then you can do even more harm.
Do a lot of harm.
Absolutely. So much of this is unconscious bias, but then so much of it is intentional scapegoating, intentional ideological, bigotry.
Yeah. I'm going to go in the opposite direction of what you were talking, though.
Okay.
Because as this was going on, and I just talk about history rhyming, these fears of medical institutions falling like dominoes, really resonates right now.
Yes.
I will say this in the most loving way to my beloved progressive movements. We let it happen.
Mm.
We let it happen. And in fact, we fed the backlash against transgender people. I wasn't alive. Okay, but I'm going to part of that community. We let it happen. And I should say white progressives let it happen.
Yeah, let's say that. But
yeah, and I will explain that more.
Yeah, as you look back in the history that you can locate yourself in, what I would have been doing in the 70s or what you would have been doing, what do you see that was the harm?
Yeah. Okay. So, and I do also want to say there was a general conservative shift in the culture, right? And then kind of culminating in Reagan's election, and Reagan did a lot kind of removed protections and the ability for Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance to cover gender affirming care. So it's not all on us, okay? But the reason why.
And that's not even history rhyming. That's just history repeating at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe not, but probably. And I want to say about how this was about us, not just to I'm not trying to make us feel bad. I actually want to empower us. Right. By looking at the past and looking at where we didn't live up to what we would think our ideals would be.
Yeah.
That tells us what we can do now. So on the left, one of the things that happened was, and this is also going to rhyme, for a long time, there was an alliance in goals, or at least in activist arenas in the psychology world, between LGB, although mostly identifying as L and G, and trans, right? Because even though a lot of trans activists were working to try to get gender identity disorder added to the DSM so that it was no longer the very pejorative, transvestic fetishism, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Gay people, and I think it was mostly gay men who had the voices in this, right? We're fighting to get it removed, get homosexuality removed as a mental disorder in the DSM. So you can see that there was a tension in there, but it was a common arena of action.
Yeah, that's really, right? They're both involved in, what should be in the DSM, but they're pulling in slightly different directions for different reasons that are explicable.
Yeah. And
you can meet in the middle and see how both of those goals are pushing in the direction of a liberatory agenda, but I think as you tell the history, that is not what happened.
Right. Culminating really in 1973 when that diagnosis was removed from the DSM, and all of a sudden LGB folk didn't need to show up to those meetings.
One group exits the arena.
Right. And that's not to say that there wasn't a lot of yeah, exactly. There was a lot of abandonment and exclusion of trans activists from the very beginning of like the like contemporary queer liberation movement. So I'm not trying to minimize that was already there. But yeah, there was like an abandonment, and there wasn't at that time a lot of built up infrastructure for activism or even mutual aid amongst anyone in the LGBTQ community, and especially trans people. There were some, definitely, if you don't know about Star, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, read it.
Mm-hmm.
But there's even a famous speech that Sylvia Rivera gave, which was, "Where are you going, guys? We've been part of this the whole time. What's going on?"
And she gets booed. If it's the one I'm thinking of, like there is film of this. Yeah. And like you can hear the boos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should link it. We'll link it because it's really important, I think, to hear that voice. Right. And feminism got not great for us around that time. And I shouldn't say feminism, I should say white second wave feminism.
Yeah.
Is one of the places where the idea of gender roles at all were starting to be seen as regressive, right? And as like a sign of the patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And this also involved like butch femme lesbians getting kind of sidelined from the feminist community. But this is also where you start getting rhetoric about trans women being like inherently violent for being in women's spaces. And
right.
The wild rhetoric that we hear now online and from conservative people, you can see originating in second wave feminist literature, like basically word for word. And I'm not going to repeat it here because it's just, I don't feel like repeating it. but I will say, especially Black feminists were not on board with that, and were very like, many of them very resistant to the idea of like a woman is a woman and a man is a man, like the biological determinism of womanness.
Yeah.
Like for them sounded a lot like the biological determinism of race.
Yeah.
Right. So very, very, a lot of pushback from that perspective, which really also speaks to the intersectionality of these experiences, right? Like Black trans women dealing with biological determinism from so many directions.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'll say, like, I think that it's specifically in the Black feminist perspectives that I've read, like there's a specific argument of like, you know, we don't want the state to have this power. We don't want the state to be able to codify and legislate a supposedly, you know, biological definition of a hierarchy based on biology, because we've seen what happens when states have that power and what they use it for. It is more.
But that pushback wasn't just against the state.
Right.
It was against fellow progressives, right? I don't even, if they would even use that word, right?
Yeah, that's where I'm going. Like it's, you know, you get that divergence because it is a lot easier for the white progressive wing of the party, and specifically like the progressive end of the spectrum of like progressive to left. It's a lot easier for white progressives to look at the government and be like, oh, well, we will reform, you know, the government. We will improve the government and it will, you know, no longer be as racist. And in order to do that,
right, gotcha.
We need to give the government more power. And I think if you're coming from a perspective of, you know, real hardened skepticism, board of histories of oppression against, okay, is there another way to do this besides giving a centralized government more power? That's the sort of like thinking that brings that perspective of
right.
We should not be codifying this in biology.
And I do want to, you know, call out, there were two white people having this conversation about like Black movements in the 70s where only one of us was alive and not for most of it. But I do, though, want to go back to, I get your point. Your point is well taken. Mm-hmm. And also, like, in terms of the story that we're telling here, that pushback against white feminists was a big part of the fracturing of our alliance with LGBTQ people, with LGB people. Right. Like it was a big part of that.
Yeah.
And I won't say culminated. This is just one of the symptoms. But like San Francisco Pride in the late 70s divided into two different events, one that was trans exclusionary and one that was trans inclusive. Mm-hmm. So that's the degree to which our backs were turned from each other.
And that's also not history.
Right. And you can see that rhyming now, right?
Yeah, you can see that rhyming. That's also not history that I found easy to come by. I lived in San Francisco for, over 10 years. And I didn't just pick that up.
Yeah.
I would have had to have opened a book, and I didn't. But that's the value in opening the books.
Well, and you didn't because nobody taught you that learning queer history was important to your mental health or your work as a clinician, right?
No.
Okay.
Especially because I was a filmmaker at the time.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, even then, right? Like we're expanding that the makers of culture and the purveyors of culture not knowing this history,
yes,
is another like major. And in fact, like where are people mostly consuming historical information about LGBTQ people? It's not from their therapists. It's not in school. No. It's in TV and movies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. All right. So I'll say just a little bit about how it came back, how like that alliance was reformed, and how we ended up with gender affirming care being the standard medical approach in our field, right? So we had these difficult decades, and then like in the 90s, well, I would start with the 80s. In the AIDS crisis, absolutely horrible. I do not want this to have happened this way. But one of the things that it did was all of a sudden trans people and gay people had common cause again, right? And that does not mean that trans people were immediately given a microphone or a seat at the table. I love the story of organizations like ACT UP, but if you watch like archival video of them, you're not going to see trans femme people who are like openly trans femme people, for instance, there.
Yeah.
But there was common cause there, and organizations, infrastructure that was starting to build around LGBT rights were also part, like doing LGBT rights, because they were doing outreach on HIV, right?
Suddenly both of those groups are back in the same arena again.
Exactly. And again, like I remember a whole bunch of like at the level of politics, a whole bunch of like issues with like throwing trans people under the bus. Let's put it that way. But regardless, there was a lot more like infrastructure building up that was including trans people in LGBTQ activism, right? And then you had like a lot of activism around disability and around accessibility, culminating in the passage of the Affirmative Care Act in 2010. And that act included protections for gender affirming care as part of it, right? And then in the 90s was when like more expansive awareness of how gender interacts with sexuality was happening in like academic circles. You have third wave feminism that's starting to be much more open to like a playful approach to gender, and the idea that we can be co-creators of gender, and that does not necessarily mean we're like stuck in a patriarchal, like an internalized, like, patriarchy. So like there was a lot of thought like fulminating in the 90s that then led into things like the inclusion of protections for trans people and the Affordable Care Act in 2010. I will end on a kind of negative note, though. I asked you this before we started to record, so I can't like ambush you with it now. Do you recall? I'm going to ambush you with this. Do you recall what year gender affirming treatments were removed? The label experimental was removed from the FDA designation for gender affirming care. What year?
Well, I remember exactly how this conversation went. I'm in a pessimistic mood, and in my pessimism, I said 2012.
And you were wrong. It was 2016.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mind blown, because gender affirming care had been in practice in Western formalized medical context since the 1930s.
Yeah.
Okay. So lots and lots of progress, though. The arc of history wibbled, and then it wobbled back, and now it's wibbling again, right? So I just found that history really interesting, both like sad and inspiring, if that makes any sense. really like the thing that I find most comforting about it is looking at the way that LGBTQ organizations are not fragmenting or fracturing.
Yeah.
Right. You see the Human Rights Campaign coming out, supporting lawsuits in support of trans people. Right. And trans people like ourselves have organizations that are specifically dedicated to our rights that are strong.
Yeah.
And we didn't have that in the 70s. We had like nascent organizations with absolutely no funding.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
yeah,
what happened to us in the 70s gives us some idea of how to survive now, both politically and I think emotionally.
Okay.
All right. Looking at the time, like I preface this with, I'm super friggin' excited about this information. So I'm not surprised that we've talked about it for a half hour.
Don't worry about it.
When our goal was 15 minutes. So here's what we're going to do. This is part one. And part two is where Chris is going to lead our discussion about how important it is to know this history and experience this history, how important it is to the mental health of individuals and also to the work of the psychological world.
All right.
Okay, next time. I'm so excited. All right.
Jen, this has been wonderful. I'll see you next time.
All right. See you next time. Bye, everybody.
You've been listening to the Psych Out Podcast. For more information on today's subject, information about our charity, or to find our Patreon, check the links below. Join us next time to learn more about the psychology of who we are. At LGBTQ Evolutions, we know that change starts with people like you. Every act of kindness, every dollar, and every moment of your time brings us closer to removing the barriers that prevent our friends and family from being themselves. Together, we can create a brighter, more compassionate future for our community. Donate today with the link below.
These are difficult times. We know that some of you out there are suffering so much that you might be thinking of ending your life. If you're having thoughts of suicide, please reach out to professionals for help. You can go to an emergency room, call 911, or reach out to the hotlines we have linked in this description below. I know that many of us have had bad experiences in medical settings, but there are people, many people in this field who want you to live. Please reach out for help so that you can find them. We want you around for our next talk.